You should be able to see the Philosophy of Freedom homepage. I'm going to go to the study group and go to group 3 and 4, which this is group 3. And here's the December 23rd meeting, introduction to the study group. I'll click on that. And this takes us to the study page. I posted 2 videos on this, why a philosophy of freedom. They also discuss my approach to studying the philosophy of freedom, training in ethical individualism, which is the study group process. The skills needed by an ethical individualist is to formulate a position on something, formulate an insight into something, to get an intuitive insight. So people share the insights that they got. So that's a training in acquiring insights on something, a take on it, an insight of what they see in this text, and then share that. So that's a practice of intuitive thinking. And then the sharing of life experience. I mean, an ethical individualist needs to take these principles and apply them to their life. That's really the definition of ethical individualism, is to apply your ideals to life. The ethical individualist is a knowing doer. He's not a theorist. He's a person of action. So that's the training for the 3rd part. And then the 4th part, we need to be able to come together as a group and have a group insight, which brings us into a harmony of intentions. And that's a 3rd training, to learn how to have a group conversation. It's not an individual having an insight. The whole group can have an intuitive insight at the same time, and then be empowered by that insight into action. So that's the training. We'll be doing that every week.
One of the things that motivates me is about the philosophy of freedom is he clearly sees it a bridge to his esoteric philosophy. It seems to me it's an absolutely major fundamental point in the philosophy of freedom is to recognize our thinking as an actual spiritual activity and not a material activity, except in a certain, there are some connections there, but
yeah, that's a clairvoyant experience as intuition. And just by observing your own intuition, you can see how different that is and how it relates to clairvoyance, how it is clairvoyance. The way these ideas just spring into our head, like where do they come from? That's something that we really want to become aware of, those moments. We may not be as aware of them, but it's really important to say, oh, I just had something just happened, and be aware of it. So you can take special note and pay closer attention. This idea where the philosophy of freedom is the basis of anthroposophy, I wanted to start a study group on that in a month or so, because a lot of issues in anthroposophy are coming up because people don't have a basis in the philosophy of freedom. Steiner said anthroposophy will not work unless it's based on the philosophy of freedom. It's obvious to see why, if you just look at Waldorf education, bringing in people into the schools who know very little about even Waldorf, and certainly nothing about the philosophy of freedom.
Exactly. Yeah.
To lead a school. And what you end up with is the intention of Waldorf education just going off the wall. And that's happening throughout anthroposophy. Osna of Waldorf is denouncing Rudolf Steiner. They're talking about throwing him out, getting his name off the schools. I mean, this kind of nonsense. That's all coming out of lacking a basis in the philosophy of freedom. Because if you have a basis in the philosophy of freedom, you can identify these rubbish ideologies in a second, and they're not going to influence you.
My kids attended Waldorf. I thought, oh man, maybe I'll meet some of the teachers and get into conversations about the philosophy of freedom and so on. And then I discovered that none of them actually, if they read it at all, they weren't paying a whole lot of attention to it, and they didn't really have anything to say about it.
Well, a while back, I did a search on ethical individualism, and there's practically nothing on the internet about ethical individualism. I mean, how is that possible? If that's the really a foundation of anthroposophy. And if you ask an anthroposophist, what is ethical individualism, they can't even answer it. That was, several years back, but that's horrifying. I mean, I know in Waldorf teacher training, they'll have a course. They always have a course on philosophy of freedom, but they obviously don't get anything out of that course. I know it's kind of dismissed. It's been dismissed in anthroposophy as, that's the philosophical basis of anthroposophy. And as soon as you mention the word philosophy, then people just dismiss it because like, oh, yeah, I'm sure it's some kind of complex philosophy that lays the basis of blah, blah, blah. Like, who cares, So right there, that attitude dismisses it. That's not the way I approach it at all. I approach it as a life philosophy that's very specific, has very clear concepts that you can apply to life. And it's a science of freedom. So it's not like the vague philosophy for academics and philosophers. It's a science based on psychological observations that everybody can make. And it's reachable. Intuitive insights and the clairvoyance discussing the philosophy of freedom is something that every normal person should be having. They just need to become more aware of it. And there's nothing in the philosophy of freedom that is beyond a normal person. The way I approach it is to learn these concepts, simplify them and learn them clear enough. I mean, no, one of the problems has been the translations are very terrible. I have a translation that's only available on my website. I haven't published it. That's cleaned it up from all the confusing stuff. It's under easier edition link. That will cut through most of the stuff, confusion, just by having a good translation.
I'm wondering what's your process in that? Are you translating from German or are you translating from personal life experience?
There's about 12 English translations. I went over all 12 of them and took the best lines out of all 12 of them and condensed them into one edition. So
okay, so you're working with translations, not the direct German.
I take the 12 translations, translator programs, and my knowledge of what he's talking about. Since I've worked through the book, I know what he's trying to say. I can relate to the experience, so I have a sense of what he's trying to say because of my work with the book for 30 years. So then I take the best wording from a dozen different translations and then make an all-star translation. So it's really interesting because every line in there, you've got now 12 different versions of English translations of a particular sentence. And there's always one that really hits the nail on the head and really expresses that clearly. Out of all the different translations, there's always one that just really is great. Then I just grab that one.
There have been times where I'm reading along and everything's going fine, and then these are usually pretty smart people I'm reading, right? And so I expect them to be they may be right or wrong, but I expect them to be making sense most of the time, at least, you make that distinction. And I'll come across periodically and say, no, that just cannot be translated right because it just doesn't fit in with the flow that's been going on.
The Philosophy of Freedom is a political book in that the values in the Philosophy of Freedom are intended to lay the foundation of a social and political order. All politics and social life, it's all based on your values. If you have a solid foundation in good values, then that will affect everything else. And Steiner intended the Philosophy of Freedom as a science of freedom. See, it's not just somebody's opinions about values. I mean, it's a set of ethical principles. It's a science of freedom, saying that this is how you free people through this science. It's a science of how the mind works. You're keeping in mind these principles of how to free the human being, so you don't squash the individual or individuality. You don't censor because you value individual expression. You support the cultivation of unique individuality. You don't herd everybody in groups and everybody should conform to the message of the group, the narrative of the group. That's all very suppressive of the cultivation of unique individuality. You don't want to go there in whatever system you're setting up. I've never seen so many losses of freedom and so much censorship happening so rapidly ever. It's always for a greater cause. Yeah, you need to give up these freedoms for a greater cause, for the collective and all this stuff. Well, that doesn't really work. The collective and the community depends on these unique creative individuals because they're the ones that are getting the creative thoughts and solving the problems. They need to have a voice. People need the collective needs to listen to these people. If they're silenced, the collective will not work out well for the collective.